Okay, thank you very much for coming here for this discussion. First of all, I'm very glad that you are here, János, Csák János, Minister of Culture and Innovation, if this is right to say so, and Dr. Calum Nicholson, philosopher, anthropologist from Cambridge with a PhD, if this is right, at Cambridge University. So our topic for today is the future of science and the science of future of the future. And I have altogether 7 questions which I shared with my colleagues, and I would like to talk about these questions with you, or alternatively you can raise different questions or problems or change the focus if you want to, so it's up to you certainly, but I have 7 questions, and let me list the questions first of all for the audience, for our visitors, just to have the big picture, so to say. So the first question is, how do we understand science? What is the difference between scholarship and science? How much are they interrelated? So this is one question. The second is, what do you think of the development in Asia? What are the chances of Western productive science as opposed to China, Japan, Korea, India? Question 3. What is the most important technological field today in your understanding? What is the science of the future? What are the sciences of the future in the plural? Question 4. What is the next important field of technological or technical build-up? Gene engineering, a new generation of wireless communication, solar research, energy technologies, general robotics, or something else? Question 5. How could Hungarian scientific education help the rise of a new generation of leading scientists today and tomorrow? So this is about persons. Education. Question 6. What can the Hungarian government do to enhance the birth and growth of talented scholars and intellectuals that may be able to help understanding the global prospects of human knowledge? And the last question. What is your view of the importance of spirituality, religion, spirituality, in important discoveries in the sciences? Okay, so it is your turn. Let's start with the first question. How do you understand science? What is science?
Well, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for inviting me. I would like to take advantage of the fact that Calum is a philosopher, so before talking about science, I suggest that we take a step back and we talk about knowledge. Because science, it's not rocket science that you put something heavy on it. So science and scholarship are kind of systematic parts of the knowledge, but there are several other types of knowledges. The first type of knowledge is to make humankind to be able to survive. That's the first number one thing, that anything that helps that, either it's scientific or scholarly, is an important knowledge. The second is the how to reduce the 3 bad things in life: hunger, violence, and the third is general human suffering. And then we can talk about how to produce human goods, how to help attachments, how to help belonging, how to help improving the quality of our life. Now, for that, we need an understanding. We have to comprehend the complexity of the world and find our place under the sun. And then, it's not enough that we understand or comprehend the world, but we have to be able to organize. Now, that's a knowledge as well. Many of you studied managerial sciences, so to say. So comprehending and delivering. And then comes science. Science is kind of limited practical knowledge, systematic research in understanding nature. So we put the questions to nature and we try the nature answer us. That's science. It's different from the scholarly knowledge, from this from this kind of knowledge, because in humanities, in human sciences, we cannot do the same experiments as in physics, for example. You cannot repeat, because we humans, we are emotional, we are irrational, so you cannot repeat those experiments that you can do in science. Therefore, when we talk about scholarly things like humanities and these kind of things, you have to rely on authorities, people who think and who the scholastics, the word scholastics comes from there. People with authority can tell what in their experience, in their knowledge, in their learning, in their view, what is good and bad from the point of view of survival, comprehension of the world, and organizing the world. But knowledge, yet again, is even broader, because we know that we can get knowledge, for example, from the arts. We can get knowledge from philosophy, political philosophy or moral philosophy. Obviously, we can get knowledge from science, and we can get knowledge from religion. And over time, in different historic periods of the humankind, sometimes, for example, in the Greek policies, it was the political philosophy which basically defined the worldview. In the Renaissance, it was the arts that had a major impact on people's thinking about their environment and the complexity of the world. And nowadays, it seems that science took over. If you look at what happens in Europe, we are digging and getting rid of Christianity, any kind of religious view. Arts are confused. Political philosophy is almost non-existent. And science claims that science can give the answers. And it's not right. Science cannot give you the answers for what is a human good or what is not. Thank you.
Everything I have to say is very complimentary, I think, to what you've just been talking about, because it seems to me that certainly in the Anglosphere we have this distinction between the sciences and the humanities, and people increasingly seem to think that the humanities are just a sort of amateur version of the sciences, that eventually, when they grow up, they will be just as scientific. It's even implied in the phrase social science, this idea that it could aspire to be science. But I've always felt this is fundamentally wrong, because if you think about what the sciences, the physical sciences, and the humanities study, they have different objects. The sciences study unity, the unity of physics, of chemistry, the patterns that underlie everything. But the problem is the humanities do not study a unity, they study a plurality, which is us. We all may look at exactly the same thing. We could all watch the same talk or have the same conversation, and we all have a different interpretation of it. We could be looking at the same object, and one of us may think it's beautiful, one of us may think it's ugly. And we may indeed disagree with ourselves throughout the day. If I've not had a cup of tea in the morning, I think very differently about a lot of things than if I do. So there is a difference of subject, and there's a real danger, I think, in the academia now of people often say there's a problem of the humanities and the sciences not being reconciled. But the danger is actually not quite that. The danger is we think they can be reconciled by all of them adopting the same methods as the sciences. And there's a phrase of this in the philosophy of science to describe this problem where we think science can't just be a guide to the facts, but also a guide to our values. And the word for that is scientism. And in the 20th century in philosophy, in the late 20th century, there was a lot of wisdom coming out of philosophy of science based on humility. The humility to realize that science is not a guide to truth. It may be a guide to the facts, but the truth is something more complex. The truth is often something that's aesthetic or moral, to do with values and culture. And we seem to have forgotten that in recent years. One of the issues, personally, I've had around, and this is not a political point either direction, but I think the problem with the way we've discussed issues like climate and COVID, for instance, is we've assumed the only questions are scientific ones. But if you take COVID as an example, the science, the virology of the disease, the epidemiology of how it spreads in populations are scientific questions. But the question of the proportionality of the policy response is also a subjective cultural question. Questions like, is there more to life than the avoidance of death? Those are not questions science can answer. They are fundamentally political questions. And across the West, what you're seeing recently is increasingly people are thinking that we can dissolve all political questions to either questions of law for judges to deal with, or questions for experts to deal with, scientists and so on. But this is a danger of the tyranny of expertise, that there are still all the important questions of life will always be ones we can contest, will always be ones grounded in plurality and the negotiation of plurality and compromise and so on. And so I think one of the dangers when we talk about science is that we increasingly think that there is just scientific knowledge. But again, all the things that really mean anything to us in our lives, meaning, love, all these things, they're all about, all the things that make us human are inherently subjective. They're inherently plural. And I think sometimes when we talk about science these days, we forget that science is a tool for use, but it cannot tell us what is true, which that use serves. So that would be my general thoughts on the place of science.
Thank you very much, Calum. Well, you both agree then that scientism is not so important in every dimension of human life, but we see that, and this belongs to the second topic here, we see that, for instance, China, which went through a tremendous technological development during the past 30, 40 years, has been able to help people out of poverty, out of suffering in many ways, you know, even due to a certain kind of Chinese wisdom, you can call it ideology, created a certain peaceful atmosphere as against violence, the thing you mentioned. And I'm not sure they are, because there is a very strong emphasis on human wisdom in China today. So perhaps we can say that at the same time we see an incredible development of the technical sciences. So what do you think of this double or dual aspect of the Chinese development then?
Well, I mean, I used to live in China for a couple of years, and I think it's worth talking about America actually in the context of China, because I don't think we can talk about China in any meaningful sense without understanding the comparative perspective of seeing what are we thinking of China as being different from. And typically it's America. I know Mr. Czak's recently written a book called American Genius about trying to work out what is the essence of the American genius. And it's an interesting book. I read it a few months ago, and it's interesting that when I think of American genius, I think it's the recognition the Americans have that friction is a dependable source of illumination. That you rub two ideas together, you get sparks, you get heat, you get light, and that's it's very much embedded in the European tradition. This sense of challenging things, putting at the center of the culture a contestation of some sort. And the Americans, as they always do, have taken it perhaps to an extreme, for better or worse. But they, in some contexts, the Americans can be incredibly productive like that. I think one of the danger China has is that there is not that diversity of what they might term cognitive diversity in the same way. There is a conformity to things. You can see this in policy. So, for instance, do you remember with the lockdowns when they happened in China? I don't mean to be always giving COVID examples, but as it's China. When the lockdowns ended, it just happened overnight, having had these draconian lockdown policies. The reason that happened was that it's a very top-down system. whatever the person at the top says, then it trickles all the way down. There's no room all the way down for someone to think for themselves. And I think the Chinese education system as well tends to favor people who are very good at passing set tests, where they're very good at learning the answer. But the thing is, what we need to be creative is not necessarily to be proficient at finding the prescribed answer. It's about tearing apart the question. All innovation is about saying, not so much, I've got a new answer, but saying, hang on, are we asking the right question? But inherently saying that's not the right question is a challenge to authority. It could be the authority of the lecturer, the teacher, the researcher, your manager, the president, whatever it may be. And the danger I think China runs into, or the challenge they probably face, is I don't think that there's that scope to question questions. So I'm curious what they do. They're very good at answering questions. But whether they're actually culturally there's a space to question them, I do wonder. And that's one thing I think here we in the West have, is a sense of being able to dissolve questions. Indeed, the greatest philosopher talking about dissolving questions was from Vienna Wittgenstein, which is very Central European. So that would be my thought on China.
I agree with Calum that when we talk about China, we can't help thinking about Europe or the Western Hemisphere. And in the West, we had basically a basic belief, which is enshrined in the Bible, that in God's will, we have stewardship of the earth, that we know the earth, that we have to understand the earth and our environment. And hence, the wondering, the curiosity comes. And if it's true that God created us in the image and resemblance of himself or herself, then, and he is or she is omniscient, then we approach that. So there is a long avenue, and there is always a new peak beyond the next one. And this is what drives the white people or the Western people. Now, in China is different. China historically lacked that kind of curiosity because they wanted to have some harmony. And in the recent years, I would say the recent 30, 40 years, since 1984, since Deng Xiaoping, there was a big opening. And China started digesting and understanding the benefits of the Western systematic thinking. But, and they are very successful, as you said. They elevated 800 million, that's double of the population of the European Union, from poverty, from $2 a day to not just that, a day, some $8 a day. But what is a problem in China that over the last 70 years they lost the metaphysical grounding, be that Taoism, Buddhism, or Confucianism. And the Confucian basics have been ruling China for 2,600 years, 600 years before Christ. And in one of the analects that the pupils of Confucius put together, the 27th one, it says that I look at things in the world and I act based on digesting those facts. And I differentiate the good things and the bad things, and I follow the good things. Now, the definition of the good, what is human good, is a big question, because technology is just a tool to make life easier. Yet again, science and technology won't answer the questions what is good and what is bad, what is evil and what is proper or right. So in China, I think it still will grow technologically, but they have to find some metaphysical basis. And just let me quote a couple of numbers to you. STEM science, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. In 2018, according to the statistics by UNESCO and the World Economic Forum. In China, 4.7 million students graduated from STEM. 4.7. 20 years ago, it was just 360,000. So they increased it more than 10 times. India, 2.7 million, similar population. US, 700,000. So it's no wonder that that if you look at the patents, if you look at the patents to market, that China now is leading the world league tables. And I travel China quite often, and I used to be on the board of Chinese companies, and I know that they are really deeply searching their soul but what the purpose? One purpose is to overcome the US, that they cannot be humiliated again. Right now, the GDP of China, the nominal GDP, is just 20% off from the US number, but on purchasing power parity, China's GDP is now bigger than the US's. So the Chinese question, what is the good, what is the purpose of those technological or scientific advances, why we do that, is an important one, and actually it's important for us in the Western Hemisphere as well.
Okay, you can add your opinion on that, but let me mention the following. We are working on what we call the Hungarian Encyclopedia of Philosophy, and we just received the article Chinese Philosophy, and this was written by Dr. Melinda Pop from Alta University, a very good article, really. And it says at the end of the article that, as a matter of fact, I mean, traditional Chinese wisdom in the form of Taoism, Confucianism, and so on and so forth, is spreading among the young, and it is even supported by the government in various ways. Of course, there are differences in emphasis, no question. I mean, technological science is absolutely important for the Chinese. Even in Esztergom, where we have the Suzuki factory, which is a Japanese factory, as we know, more and more Chinese cars are appearing. Yes, MG cars, but these are Chinese cars, as a matter of fact. So there is a balance, perhaps, but you know it better. And of course, when I say that scholarship, humanities, if you like, and science are different, I have in mind a Hungarian expression for science, which is tudomány, as we know. But tudomány has a more complex meaning, not only the scientific, technological branches, but also the humanities, scholarship in a general sense, the morality, aesthetics, and so on and so forth. But it seems that the fate of a country today is fundamentally decided by the level of cutting-edge science. It seems to me. So what do you think of this? The fate, I mean how developed a country can be. There's a rivalry here between Slovakia on the other side of the Danube and Hungary. And if you go over to Slovakia, you see the development, the technological development.
Well, I think something worth bearing in mind is that throughout history, we've tended to see science as a way to counter our manias. So science helped us get away from superstition and so on. One of the dangers, I think, in the last couple of decades is increasingly science is serving our manias. If you look at the proliferation of ideological contagions across social media, that's absolutely algorithmically driven. And the reason I mention this, because you say about the countries that have the most advanced technology are pushing ahead, I think we better not speak too soon, because actually it's the most advanced countries right now that are developing the most issues around what's loosely termed mental health. There's political polarization. There's all these sorts of issues that could undermine the very fabric of the tapestry into which we're all woven in society, and it could dissolve things quite easily. And if the social compact collapses, if trust collapses in a society, then it doesn't matter how good your weapons are or how good your computers are or anything else, because you'll turn them on each other. And so I think that there's a tendency, I think we think that progress is fundamentally a technological phenomena, but actually it's, there is the thing that is the context that allows that to happen is stability. And we can only go to the factory if the factory is still standing because it hasn't been knocked down or burned in a riot or whatever it may be. So I think that we really need to be conscious that science, I think, is driving a lot of the problems, may undermine the foundation that has allowed science to thrive in the cultures in which it has thrived.
Right, I agree. And I think science makes sense only if it serves human goods. And let's take one human good. Evolutionary psychologists claim that the deepest need of human beings is attachment. Now, if science tells us that, and the methodologically in science, even in social sciences, we call it methodological individualism. If science doesn't serve the human good of attachment, it will fail. It takes some time, but it will fail. So when you talk about competition between countries in technological or scientific results, or understanding or delivering, I always question whether that country can survive or they are distancing themselves or disconnecting themselves from human attachment. And what we see, for example, in the Western world, that some fundamental features of attachment or belonging have been questioned. One is religion. In religion, every Sunday in our Western world, for ages, people went to the church and they knew that 1,000 kilometers away, other people went to the same church listening to the same lessons. Or if you think about nations are falling apart in Europe. There are problems in the US. What is the heart, what is the soul of the what is the genius of the United States? If you talk to a black person, he will say something different. If you talk to a Native American, she will talk about something else, and so on, or a Spanish speaker. So technology and science only works if it serves human goods. Now the trick is that science claims that it adheres to logic and consistency. But in moral philosophy, you need logic and consistency. Hence the Catholic social teaching, for example. That's the most beautiful logical argumentation for human goods. So even if today, you are right, Balázs, we can compare countries about their scientific output, I don't think that those countries are the most successful that have the highest output. As I talked about China, they have the highest patent and other publications outputs, but they are still don't know what they want to do. This Communist Party vision is just the surface.
Yes, so even if my original plan was to talk about science in the precise sense of this word and think about Hungary's possible and or actual role in scientific progress, if you like, it seems that we return to more fundamental questions. I am a philosopher and I have published on religion a lot, so I agree that these are absolutely important. And I am from Esztergom, as some of you know, and here we have 24 churches in this small town, and each Sunday these 24 churches are more or less full with people here. Yes, yes. So there is a church attendance here much higher than the average, even in Slovakia or in Hungary. You know, so I very much sympathize with these approaches, no question. But you know, did you have a chance to see this movie, this new movie, Oppenheimer?
Not yet, but I've
Not
seen
yet.
the trailer.
Okay,
Yeah.
so you know one of the main actors in this movie is Wigner, the Hungarian-born physicist who contributed to the invention of the H bomb, you know. And well, I haven't seen the whole movie either, but it seems that yes, I mean, in this country we used to have, and perhaps still have in some sense, a very high-level cutting-edge science. Well, perhaps yes. Also in the humanities, no question, and philosophers. There is Hungarian philosophy. Well, you mentioned Wittgenstein, okay, but what about Polanyi, Michael Polanyi? Michael Polanyi is he's a great mind, and his book, Tacit Knowledge, Personal Knowledge, sorry, is comparable to the best works of Wittgenstein, in my understanding at least. So, of course, we have high-level philosophy here, and culture and the arts in general. But what about science? I mean, there is a tendency of losing previous positions in rankings, if you see the Hungarian results today. So I believe it would be very important, not in spite of or going against the general cultural background or development, but still we need, leading scientists like Gulyás Balázs, you know, the new president of the Hungarian Research Network, or Freund Tamás, and so on and so forth. So what do you think of this? Well, I do not deny the importance of all the several aspects you mentioned, but still, so what do you think of this?
I'm sorry if I was misunderstood. I'm not talking about against science. What I'm talking about, that for the full human comprehension knowledge, besides science, you need several other types of reflections, like artistic, like religious, like philosophical. And this is why I argue that in Hungary we have at least two very important basic prerequisites for science and others. One is mathematics. If you look at the competitions in mathematics, on a per capita basis, Hungary is way up in the list in winning those competitions. So on a per capita basis.
Yes.
The second one is Israel. The third one is Romania, but I guess because of Transylvania. And there are lots of Hungarians. Wow. Hungarians, Erdős and others, we know, in mathematics...
We have great Romanian scholars as well,
yes,
don't forget.
Yeah, no, but in mathematics,
mathematics. They are not so
competitions,
good in
yes. And there are very good Romanian musicians and others as well. The second is the Hungarian language. In the nuclear sciences, Teller, Wigner, Leo Szilard, they all claimed, had they not been taught in Hungarian, in mathematics and others, they might not have been that successful in physical sciences. Actually, a friend of mine, David Goldman, who is the deputy editor of the Asian Times, long time lived in Hong Kong, now he lives in New York, he said that Hungarians saved the United States of America 3 times, and they are waiting for the fourth one. The first one was Wigner, Leo Szilard, via inventing the original nuclear bomb, the atomic bomb. The second one was John von Neumann, because with the computer model, he was able to trigger a technological advance that, for example, in a US rocket, the control part was big like this, and in the Russians was big like that. And for such a rocket, you need more energy. So, and the computer. So Neumann was the second, and Edward Teller was the third, winning the Star War under President Reagan. And he says that now it's time again that Hungarians step up, and he had particular suggestions that I don't share here.
Okay, so what do you think of this as a British?
Yeah, so just two comments. First, about Hungarian language. I'm trying to learn, and nagyon lassan tanulok magyarul. My Hungarian's not very good. It's a very difficult language. But one thing I've discovered is that I was speaking to a friend who works in a big corporation. He says the corporation really likes employing Hungarians because he said somehow they think about problems differently. It was some big, I can't remember which one it was, but they discovered that the Hungarian employees often just have a slightly different angle on some problems that leads to quite creative solutions. And it must be something, and I've heard this again and again, there's something in the language where the grammar perhaps, where you just look at things slightly differently. Which is, is interesting and quite mysterious to me in some ways. But the other thing I was going to say about science and the status of it, because I'd agree with Minister Czák that I don't think we were against science, but I do think one thing that is happening is science's status has never been so solid, so secure, and indeed there's never been so much funding for science. And I think one of the reasons sometimes it's difficult for smaller nations, I think, to compete in science is because increasingly science has become so sophisticated, there's a vast amount of infrastructure needed. If you go back 100 years, science was people with wooden lab tables doing experiments with pipettes, but now you need vast billion-dollar facilities to do it. And so it's a matter of scale. That's one of the reasons why America is so dominant, is it has the scale on it. It's kind of like aircraft carriers, really, because the Americans have more aircraft carriers than everyone else put together. And the reason everyone else doesn't have aircraft carriers is they're extremely expensive. But even the Chinese can afford them, but they don't have very many because it takes decades of know-how to work out how to work an aircraft carrier. And they can't make that up overnight. And so the Americans have both the long-term investment of a stable period since World War II, certainly, plus the resources. And China has the resources but not the time, and most countries have neither the resources or the time, as an analogy. But I think, again, one of the issues today, and this goes back to what Minister Czák was saying, is that I think that the danger we face is not that science isn't funded enough. The danger we face is that we forget entirely that not all questions are scientific ones, where we start to think that the only thing kids should study is STEM. Because if you look at all the great scientists, most of them were great. Einstein was great not because Einstein was good at math. He was very good at math compared to most of us here. But his genius was his ability to look at a problem and ask different questions about it, to have different analogies. He thought quite visually about it. It was the ability to cross-fertilize between the artistic side of him and the scientific. And without that creative impulse, without recognizing the importance of institutions that do that. I know Hungary, for instance, I know about there's the Art and Design University here, MoMA, for instance. And that's a very important type of institute to have in a country, because I think it's one of the leading institutions here now in terms of internationally. And that's an important, art is not just secondary, it's not just aesthetics. It's central to how we think about not just life, but as you say, life is about problems, about solving and fixing our problems. And those often start with an intuition, which is often artistic in its basis. So the issue is not, I don't think, there's a danger of science not having sufficient status or sufficient respect. I think we have far too much deference sometimes to science. Not all questions are questions science can answer, nor should they be attempting to.
Now, let me add one thing, Balázs, if you allow me.
Go ahead.
Because I totally agree with you, Calum, that the connecting different parts of the knowledge is important. And in the science, they call it, in social sciences as well, interdisciplinary. And there are two fields where we Hungarians, we are leading forces in the world. One is network science, Barabási Albert László, but Réka Albert for University of Pennsylvania and others, or at Corvinus, there is a big data and network science effort led by a Chilean friend of mine, Cesar Hidalgo. And the second is bionics, combining biological systems with electric system. systems, digital systems. There are two places in the world. One is in Budapest, in the Pázmány Péter University, established by the late Tamás Roska professor, who was actually a devout religious man, and he always connected the technological advances, be that biology or technical sciences, with the greater purpose. And in Berkeley, he spent half of his time at Berkeley and half in Budapest and crossover. So interdisciplinarity is a hope or potential cure for scientism, because those people who are ready to understand that there are other ways of looking at from like in the Latin word, reflection, reflex, from another light, from another angle, that helps. If you are narrow, you might be able to solve one little problem, but won't create human good.
Okay, but would you say that, just to enlarge the picture a little bit, that Europe, especially the European Union, is still something like a successful community for such an interdisciplinary approach? I'm asking this because here is a small book written by David Angel, a Belgian historian. This is a Hungarian translation of his short French book, Que faire, what to do, this is the title. And his fundamental thesis that the European Union is tragically, or at least dramatically, declining in terms of culture, in terms of science. Is this true? What do you think? Yes, go ahead.
Well, I mean, I can't speak to the specifics. I'm not a great expert on the European Union. Having left it as a Brit, we don't have to pay attention anymore. But no, I think there is a danger, though, I think, well, there's a great book by Jared Diamond, Guns, Germs and Steel, that some of you may have read. And he says his argument, which you can contest, but it's an interesting argument, he says the reason Europe really took off was precisely that it wasn't uniform. He says China didn't take off because the Yellow and the Yangtze rivers create Zhongguo, the Middle Kingdom, which was a unified area where there were very easy lines of communication with the two rivers. But that led to uniformity. So if you had a dissident or you had a scientist who didn't follow the orthodoxy, they couldn't escape anywhere. They were stuck. Whereas in Europe, you had these geniuses with new ideas, and they could flee across the Pyrenees or across the Alps, or they could go to Britain or something. And so actually Europe's creative power, the friction of ideas, he argues, is largely because of its geography, of being this place that it's a fairly small space in which it's quite easy still to have different cultures, different politics. And that diversity was its strength. Now, of course, we don't worry so much about getting across the mountains now. The technology's changed. But I do think what's happened with the European Union, as I remember it, was that it's actually created a sense of conformity increasingly. The Brits like to talk about them legislating for straight bananas and things. That was Boris Johnson's big thing. But I do think there's something in that if you try and standardize things, you standardize thinking. If you start to standardize currencies, you start to standardize legal systems, you start to harmonize everything, it can be very useful if you want to make more efficient what we have now. But if you want to create the diversity to create what we will have in the future that's different, perhaps it's not such a good model. So there's pros and cons to all these things. But I'm no expert on the European Union, though.
Well, when we talk about China, we have to consider the Western Hemisphere. When we talk about Western Hemisphere, European Union, we have to consider China. And Calum, to connect the Yangtze River with the Yellow River, it's 1,800 kilometers. The Chinese built a channel 2,300 years ago. And it still works. A great communication. It was for flood management, for communication, people and goods. Now, the distance between London and Budapest is 1,500 kilometers. Imagine a channel through the hills, through the meadows, everything, 1,800 kilometers, built 2,300 years ago. So there is something in China what we still don't understand. Now coming back to the issue, whether the European Union is up to the job or not, or understand what happens, that reminds me to a case back in 1964. There was, in the US, there was a commission for extraterritorial intelligence. So basically intelligence
Terrestrial.
terrestrial. And the Russians set up a similar institute. And the Russian one was run by a professor called Kardashev. And he claimed that we can figure out, we can discover extraterrestrial civilizations via looking at patterns, energy patterns in the universe. Because successful civilizations will need lots of energy, so they will have to source energy from their own solar system or whatever, than from their galaxy. And there must be a sign of that. Now the Americans, there was a guy called John Barrow, and he said that successful civilizations will hide because they will be afraid of other civilizations attacking them. Look at Hollywood movies. And he said that successful civilizations will start miniaturization of things, reduce energy use, to reduce size of machines, to reduce size of equipment and technology. And after all, the American way won, because we have lack of energy, we have to miniaturize things. So these are two worldviews. So in the European Union, right now, I don't know what's the worldview of Madame von Leyen or any leaders in the European Union. What is their vision for 2040? When I am in Brussels, and I am in the scientific committee, I am in the cultural committee, there is no such thing as family committee. Family is not an allowed word in Brussels. But anyway, I am in these committees. And when I say, let's think about 2040, they all just lose interest. They are thinking about short cycles, and you cannot talk about steps today. You cannot talk to your wife or to your husband about life without thinking about what we will do together 10 years down the road or 20 years down the road. And there are these bureaucratic papers about strategies, but not really followed through. So my answer is, I don't know.
Well, of course, we have well-known slogans concerning the green energy projects and the solving the problems with the climate and so on and so forth, and changing the whole structure of civilization, which also needs some kind of technological change, even if we do not see the details of such a technological change, except electric machines, autos, automobiles, and so on and so forth, which is a very tricky problem in many ways, so I do not want to enter this. But it seems, so my question is this: if we see that the European Union, or Europe in general, is losing ground as opposed to in a competition with United States on the one hand, and Asia on the other hand, can we consider the Hungarian situation in terms of science, culture, independently of this European situation? Are we hardwired into this kind of crisis we are witnessing in Europe? Perhaps even the UK included. I don't know. So what do you think of this? Can we follow an independent, completely different path, either in terms of science or in terms of general culture?
No, it's impossible. Science, scholarship, life is kind of universal. And Hungary is not a island. We are in the heart of Europe. The question is whether we can broaden our view to a global view. Over the last 1 year or 14 months, since I've been a minister, my travels went to South Korea, Japan, Singapore, China, and the US, and Germany, for that matter. We have to connect those people who are ready to think about scientific and scholarly humanities issues that are not on a non-ideological way. And there is a great reception in for example, in Asia. In Singapore, one of my partners, one of the ministers, told me at a dinner that, you know, we love talking to you Hungarians. And I said, okay, that's very kind of you. And why? Because you don't lecture us on ideological basis. Whenever someone comes, and I won't name nations, where people come, ministerial or other people, and they start lecturing them. While economically, technologically, they are going like this, and we are going like that in Europe. So we cannot disconnect, and our interest, Hungarian interest, is to be connected as many ways, as many potential routes to scientific institutions, higher education, and we have to understand what's going on in the world, and in some parts we have to be on the leading edge, and we are doing it. That requires, from within, domestically, talent management. Okay. That's one of the greatest program in the new Hungarian research network. Particular talent management, yes. And we will be bringing in foreign scholars as well.
Yes, it is now called the Hungarian Research Network. It used to be called Ötvös Loránd Research Network. But Calum, so you are from the UK. So how do you see this problem? Are we isolated? I mean, is Hungary isolated culturally, scientifically from the rest of Europe? Or what is your experience? What is your understanding of this situation?
Well, I mean, I can't speak with any particular expertise, and following the Minister for Culture and Innovation would be tricky to say anything useful. But I do think that no, I mean, I think if people are isolated in Europe, it's a choice. I don't think the European Union or being part of Europe is a negation of anything. It's a positive thing, but I think if anything, it's an accelerator. It gives a broader platform to collaborate with China or indeed the United States. One of the great advantages of the EU that as the UK we've now lost is that collective leverage, and I think that can be the case in education too. It does raise questions as to what specifically is Hungarian about, say, Hungarian research, Hungarian innovation, Hungarian science, Hungarian culture. We all know there are things that are unique to it, but the question of how you actually manifest that or explain that cross-culturally is challenging for anyone. So I don't think there's a restriction per se. I would say, though, kind of on a slightly different note on the same topic, that I think everywhere education is facing the same challenge, and I think it's here as well. It's certainly in the UK, which is that no matter, whenever you build an institution, institutions have their own logic of consolidation and perpetuation. They want to get bigger, and they want to get more complex, and middle management takes over, and it ceases to be about education as an end in itself, but an education or an institute as a means to some sort of bureaucratic end. And I think what I'm talking about is the dead hand of technocratic, bureaucratic management is the death knell of creative thinking. And it seems to me that if you look at all the great geniuses in history, and indeed you conclude in this, the great Hungarian geniuses, they're often pretty eccentric characters, don't play well with others, to have strange disciplinary backgrounds, thought very laterally, made interesting connections across disciplines, and from that came these incredible new ideas. If you have a system where everything is siloed, what we do is we cut off that type of creativity. And life is not siloed, but we think about life in a very siloed way. We have disciplines, sociology, psychology, engineering, all these different things. But those are crude tools. It's not the real thing. And the great geniuses are able to see things in the whole, and therefore to formulate new questions, because they see new problems that may cut across all these disciplines. In fact, the categories and the disciplines we have may not actually be the means by which we solve our problems. They may be the problem we're trying to solve. And this is often the case in philosophy. Most philosophical problems reduce the problem of the old Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy problem of where they said, what is the answer to life, the universe, and everything? And the computer says 42. And they say, well, we don't understand the answer. And the computer says, maybe you don't understand the question. And it's this is the type of, what most real problems are like. And so I think one of the challenges we face, not so much communicating across cultures about science, but within our own cultures, deadening the creative spirit by thinking that success and achievement is falling into line of whatever the fashionable category is, and you stay in your lane. But life's not a road, it doesn't have lanes. So I just think that as long as we can keep a handle on that, and I do think I've been working for MCC for the last couple of years, and one thing that's been quite fun with MCC is that at its current stage anyway, in its current position, in its life cycle, there's a great deal of openness to new ideas, a freshness with new sort of approaches to courses. That's great. The question is, can it maintain that as it gets bigger and so on? So, and that's the same with any institution.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm trying to understand your last thoughts in terms of encouragement for Hungarians and Europeans in general. And, well, yes, we didn't have time to discuss this, the question concerning the science of the future, but perhaps Csák János's answer concerning interdisciplinarity, if this is a word, can help, right? So it is not only about one concrete scientific discipline, but rather a complicated structure, complexity of approaches, a variety of approaches to problems, scientific, cultural, and spiritual, religious, spiritual problems. So thank you very much. I think we are approaching the last minute of our time here. Thank you very much for coming, for sharing your views on these very important, crucial questions. Thank you, Calum. Thank you.
Thank you.
Professor. And see you next time. See you at our next program.
Thank you.
Nagyon köszönöm.